Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. This is potentially the greatest mod in the history of sim racing. Now, why would I open this video with such an accolade? Well, those of you who have been following the race department forums for the Formula 2000 V10 will have some idea of what I'm on about. This, from Race Sim Studio, is their latest and unarguably greatest ever creation, Formula 2000 V10. This car captures absolutely everything that was and is so legendary about Formula 1 in the 2000 season. 2000, it was an absolute epic. We had Michael Schumacher, Mika Häkkinen, Ferrari, McLaren going at it hammer and tongs for the World Championship. Mika Häkkinen, the defending 2-times world champion, trying to win 3 on the trot, but a resurgent Ferrari led by an ever-dominant Michael Schumacher took the Constructors' Championship and, for the first time in decades, the Drivers' Championship for the Scuderia at the end of the season. It was an absolute epic, and even to this day, nigh on 19 years later, the highlight reels from the 2000 season are something that fans, young and old alike, both absolutely gush over. What we had in this era, we had the V10 engines that sounded absolutely phenomenal. We had incredible driving talent up and down the grid at both the back and the front. We had cars that were loud, they were powerful, yet they were not bolted to the tarmac like we see in modern times. They did not run slick tires. They did not run absolutely huge wings and trick double-decker and triple-decker diffusers. They were purebred, thoroughbred racing cars. They had great engines. They had semi-auto gearboxes, 6- and 7-speed units scattered throughout the field. Relatively little downforce, especially compared to the modern era, and no driver aids, no traction control, no anti-lock brakes, nothing of the sort. The only thing that kept these cars on the road was pure driving talent, and that is what we saw up and down the grid. It is for these reasons and many more that Race Sim Studio have decided to take on a project like this and give us this absolutely tremendous product, RSS Formula 2000 V10. The car, as keen-eyed viewers have already figured out, both over on Race Department and even on my own video so far with this car, it is based on the Ferrari F1 2000, which was, of course, the Formula 1 car that Ferrari fielded in the 2000 World Championship. Some specs on the F1 2000 first off, although this car is not branding itself as such. Of course, it was designed and manufactured by Ferrari for the 2000 Formula 1 season. Chief designer on the project was Rory Byrne. Of course, Ross Brawn and Jean Todt running the Ferrari team in this era. They, of course, also would have had a hand in the design, Ross Brawn in particular. The car's immediate predecessor, the F399 from the 1999 season, essentially it is an evolution of the F399 and the F300 before it. Ferrari very much in evolutionary rather than revolutionary terms in this era, and of course the design traits that this car exhibits could be seen as well on the F2001 from the following year. In terms of technical specifications, we have a carbon fiber honeycomb composite chassis. This is, of course, 2000. We have gone through the 90s and the technical explosion that happened there, and here we see the results of all of that. Carbon fiber composites throughout the principal structure of this car. In terms of suspension layout, we have a double wishbone pushrod configuration, both front and rear. The engine, as we have mentioned already, is a 3-liter V10 with a 90-degree bank angle, which was a departure for Ferrari. They had been experimenting with rather weird bank angles on engines previously, but here, a 90-degree V10, 3 liters displacement. In the Ferrari, it would have been the Tipo 049. So there it is. The transmission in the Ferrari is 7-speed, longitudinally mounted, sequential, semi-automatic, paddle-actuated box, fuel provided by Shell, and tires provided by Bridgestone. The F1 2000's competition record is rather impressive, as you might expect. Driven by Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello for the duration of the 2000 season, the car made its debut at the 2000 Australian Grand Prix, and in the balance of 17 races contested, the F1 2000 won 10 of them, took 21 total podium positions, took 10 pole positions, scored 5 fastest laps, and secured the double championship, the Constructors' Championship for Ferrari, and his third Drivers' World Championship for one Michael Schumacher, who of course would go on to dominate with Ferrari for the 4 years to follow, winning the World Championship again in 2001, 2002, 2003, and 2004 for his grand total of 7 drivers' titles from 1994 to 2004. This was an era of dominance that only now are we beginning to see again in Formula One, both constructor and driver. Of course, since then we have had dominant runs by Sebastian Vettel and Red Bull from 2010 to 2013, and of course right now we are still in the midst of Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes dominance, so far running from 2014 through 2018, and who knows where the limit may be for that absolutely great combination as well. But this is what started it all in terms of how modern Formula One looks, at least from the championship side of its overall complexion. Of course, nowadays the cars are very different. They have completely different engines. They've got 8-speed gearboxes now. They're, technically speaking, hybrids. They've got slick tires, big-time downforce, huge wings, big underbody aero going on as well. But this is what the dominant car of nigh on 19 years ago looked like. And when we get in it a little bit later on, you'll definitely understand how it was so dominant. What's more important, though, than the competition history of what this car's real-world analog was, is the information about this mod itself by RaceSim Studio. When you do purchase this mod over from racesimstudio.com and you download it, one of the first things that you're confronted with after you unpack all of the files and place them in their appropriate directories is a 13-page PDF. Now, of course, many mods are put out there with release notes, the README files and installation instructions and all of that, but not too many come with their own little informational brochure. There's a reason why RSS have done this. This mod and this car are absolutely filled with features that you might not necessarily be looking for if you didn't know that they existed. Here's what I mean. First of all, RSS, they open up in this PDF with telling us that this car was never really intended from the beginning to be anything monumental. They say, and I quote, that the project started off as a simple filler between the RSS 2 of 2017 and the Formula Hybrid of 2018. Yes, that means that this project started in 2017, and as of right now, making this video at the tail end of 2018, that means that we have had over a year of development on this car, probably on the order of 14 to 16 months. That certainly doesn't sound like a side project to me. They continue in their forward section to say that it has taken over 1,000 combined man-hours, 500 reference images, 10 hours of video, car model kits. They've managed somehow to acquire very rare and expensive technical books, I quote, and they've even gone to museums to see the F1 2000 in the flesh. I don't know if there's ever been a consumer-level sim racing product released with that amount of number one, man-hours, and number two, research poured into it. Typically, when modding teams develop a car, they look at reference photos, they look at reference videos, trying to get the sounds right and things of that nature, but I don't know if too many other modders go to the lengths to actually visit museums to see the actual car in the flesh, and reach out and touch it and figure out exactly what does it feel like, what does it smell like, things of that nature, what's its presence in the room. That's what RSS have done with this, and trust me, it shows tremendously. Here we are in showroom view with this car, and, well, it looks just like any other car in showroom view. This is what pretty much any car that we have in Assetto Corsa will look like. But if we stop the rotation here for a moment, and then we press the space bar on our keyboard, have a look at what happens next. Yeah, all of a sudden the velvet ropes come up, the car explodes into pieces, we have tire blankets put on, the car's sitting now on top of some little ramps, headrest is gone, rear wing is gone, we've got jacks underneath the front and rear wings. It looks like a museum piece, and indeed it is. What RSS have intended to do with this car, as far as I am able to tell, and deducing from the comments made by CC and others over there on the Race Department forum, they have not only endeavored to create an unparalleled sim racing driving experience, but they have also treated this car as a work of art. Exhibiting it like this in showroom view certainly does lend credence to my little theory, because when was the last time that we had a mod that has a please do not touch sign in 2 languages on top of it? Not to mention, we do have a little plinth as well over next to the right rear. Race Sim Studio Formula 2000, year 2000. Motor's 10-cylinder V10 at 90 degrees, displacing 2,996 cc. Maximum power, 806 horsepower at 18,000 RPM. Yep, it's a museum piece, it's an art exhibit, it's a technical tour de force. It is all that and more, all rolled up into one very unique and spectacular package. This is the first time I'm aware that any sort of mod or any sort of even vanilla product in a racing sim has included this type of exhibition for their car, this type of presentation. We have tire blankets on this thing, all 3D modeled with their own shaders and own meshes and textures and everything like that. You can even see the little laces that are holding them together. They do tie up to keep it tight around the wheels. We've never seen anything like this before. And it's absolutely tremendous. They've even gone through the trouble to model the texturing on the little velvet ropes themselves. That is a sight to behold, and that's something that you're not even ever intended to interface with. You're just intended to look at it. That's really spectacular. Really, it is. We'll get rid of the velvet ropes for a moment, though, and put the car back together, as we are more apt to see it. And it's just... I'm really running out of words. I'm running out of superlatives to utter about this car. Continuing with the RSS PDF, they really have gone through every expense possible in terms of manpower and resources and everything else along the way. We've talked about how it presents in showroom, but the other things that they have done with this car, it has so many vibrations on it. The front wing will wobble based off of what sort of vertical G it's accelerating. The rear wing will wobble also based on vertical G and other vibrational characteristics of this car. The cockpit surround will vibrate when you're going around at speed. The exhausts at the back, they vibrate based on how much throttle angle you've dialed in. They've really spared no detail with this car. They have gone as in-depth as they possibly could have done, and they've created something that is not only accurate from a driving sense, but they've also created something that's very accurate from a visual sense, and it's just so overwhelming to take in. Honestly, it is. Other things that this car has, when we get out on track, you'll be able to see all of this happen, but we can choose what sort of rear wing we want on this car. Just a visual update. Of course, you can also adjust the wing parameters to match, but we've got a medium downforce rear wing, we've got a low downforce rear wing. If we stop the rotation again and take a closer look at the rear zone of the car, you can take a look at what's going on there. Press the number 1 on the numpad, I believe it is, or perhaps it's number 2 or number 3 or 0. No, it's 0. Press the 0 key on the numpad and you can see that we now have a low downforce rear wing attached to this car. Press 0 again and it goes back to its high downforce configuration. Of course, this is the kind of wing you'd want to run at Monza or Hockenheim in this era, but really great attention to detail that they would have bothered to include something like that. Other attributes we can see on this car at this point. Well, what is there not to see on this thing? This is also one of the most detailed models ever to be implemented in a racing sim, particularly on the consumer level. We have got something like 120,000 individual polygons. I think the actual number is even higher than that. I can't quite seem to find that at this moment, but we have an incredibly high resolution model. You can see no pixelation anywhere on this thing, be it a shut line or a body line or a decal, whatever. It's absolutely perfect. It is far higher resolution than my screen can display. It is far higher resolution than this video will ultimately be able to display, even at 4K. It perhaps is the most detailed model in sim racing. The amount of time that went into creating something like that, I can't even begin to speculate, but it has to be on the order of hundreds of hours personally by one person putting this together. It's truly miraculous. There just are no other words that I can come up with. Before I get carried away gushing into it, let's go more into the technical sides of it. The cockpit, we can see the cockpit here. Perhaps we can get in a little bit more closely, get some more detail on it. Yeah, have a look at that cockpit. RSS, they describe the cockpit as being highly digital. It features over 50 individual LEDs, including neutral and reverse lights, on both the dash area and on the steering wheel. When we get the car live out on track, we'll be able to see that much more clearly, but you can get a sense of what's going on in there just as we are right now. Looking down into the cockpit, you can see the seat and the seat belts and the buckles. They've all been modeled, and they've even been weathered a little bit with some texturing on that central buckle. We have got rotary switches along the side of the bulkhead for adjusting things like the radio volume, things of that nature. Over here on the left-hand side of the dash, we have got a reverse light. We've got a rain light radio button. That's the master radio switch, I would imagine. We have the rescue straps here for extracting the seat and the driver from the car in the event of a serious accident, and they need to remove the seat and the driver all in one piece there for the driver's safety. Steering wheel itself, we've got all kinds of texturing details here on the hand grips. You can see that they've been weathered so that you can see where the driver's hands will have been there for hours upon hours. We've got every switch, every button on this steering wheel faithfully reproduced. It's absolutely fantastic. In the bottom section of the car where the driver would be sitting, we have "In the Memory of a Legend 2000" written here. Obviously, this is a reference to Michael Schumacher. Of course, Michael Schumacher coming back to the forefront of Formula One in 2000 with this car. And of course, we all hope that Michael Schumacher is doing as well as he can possibly do in his current condition, but not a bad idea to make some light mention of him here. Down below that in the footwell, we can see RSS Formula 2000 V10 on the floor, and down here we have the pedals. Of course, semi-automatic box in this era, just two pedals in the footwell, accelerator and brake, right and left respectively. They have also modeled the steering column going all the way down through the front of the chassis. This is something, of course, that you'll never see when you're out on track, but there it is. We have a footwell, and we've got pedals, and we've even got a little instrumentation umbilical running all the way through the floor of the car and then down. The back side of the steering wheel has also been modeled. We can see stickers here on the back, and it's fully textured. We've got the paddles for the clutch and the gear shift. It's absolutely tremendous. No detail has been overlooked. No expense has been spared in creating this car. It is entirely fantastic. Coming out of free camera view here, back to our rotation. What other things can we see, technically speaking, on this car? Well, taking a look at the front end, you can see there's that double wishbone pushrod suspension arrangement that we've talked about. Pretty much every car on the grid used this suspension configuration, both front and rear, in this era. It's just the way it was. The front wing, very simple in modern terms. It's just a double main plane wing. That upper flap is what's generating most of your downforce. You don't see the big cascade elements on these wings. Nothing like we see in 2018 Formula One, although some of that is going to be gone for 2019, perhaps returning to this in some extent. But just a very simple single element wing for the most part. End plates on the wing, some cascades there, but look at what they're not doing. They're not creating outwash. They're not trying to funnel air away from the front of the car. They're simply trying to smooth it out as it goes over top of the front wheels. So again, these cars very different aerodynamically from what we're seeing in modern F1. but of course the family resemblance is still there. Looking closer on the nose section, you can see here below the front end of the monocoque, you can see this little bulbous protrusion. That's what we call the keel, and the rear section of the suspension there, as well as the front section of the front suspension mounts to it, the bottom wishbone. That is just simply where they mounted the lower wishbones of the front suspension in this era. They were limited in terms of how severe they could make those angles in the carbon layup in this era. The carbon fiber fabrication technology didn't really exist to the extent that it does today. Obviously, it was still pretty sophisticated, but not to the point where it is nowadays. So they just needed to make that angle as flat as possible. That's where we get the keel from. The upper wishbones, they are still pretty conventional relative to what we would see today, and of course the push rods, they still work in exactly the same manner. Looking across the top side of the monocoque, we can see some hatches here where the mechanics would be able to access some of the suspension components as well as the footwell to make those changes in the garage. Moving toward the cockpit area, we just have that neutral button there for the marshals to actuate, or for the driver to actuate if he should become stuck on track and they need to pop the car into neutral. Looking down the front section, there is the tongue or the T-tray. That's the front section of the floor, leading edge of the floor, moving toward the midsection of the car. Barge board detail as well through here. Very simple, nowhere near as sophisticated as we see nowadays, but it's what these cars in this era would have had. Wheel and tire detail. Of course, we don't have real-world branding on these wheels or tires, but you can see that they have reproduced tire branding here. They are Bonged Tires Smolder in this configuration, but we've also got chalk marks on here just designating the batch number of the tire, which set they are for a given session or a given weekend. And inside there, great wheel detail, wheel nut detail, and of course inside you can see the carbon ceramic rotor, and they've even gone to the trouble to brand the brake caliper inside. Marvelous amount of detail. Midsection of the car, we've got wing mirrors mounted where they should be mounted, more antenna aerials there, and then of course top side where the refueling hatches were and the engine cover itself. Very smooth profile, no real flow modifiers in this section of the car in this area. You can just see these small flick ups ahead of the rear tires, basically just trying to do the same thing that the front wing end plates do, smoothing air over top of the rear tires, trying to cut down on as much drag as possible. Topside periscope style exhausts on this car. Ferrari pioneered this in 1998, I believe it was. The Spanish GP update brought in those topside periscope exhausts, and then most teams copied it soon thereafter. But the exhausts have been recreated very nicely, as has the heat treating on this section of the car. Of course, things would get mighty hot back here, so you want to protect that fragile carbon bodywork. Looking down at the lower section of the rear zone, here's the diffuser. This is a pretty big, pretty sophisticated diffuser for the era. Of course, the teams really went crazy a little bit later on in this decade with rear downforce in this manner, but very complicated for the era. You can see there in the bottom center section, they have bothered to recreate the starter hole. Again, no expense has been spared in terms of detail on this car. It's absolutely marvelous. I don't believe we can turn it on in showroom view, but you can see the detail there in the rear rain light and pit speed light. They have even modeled the circuit board onto which the LEDs are mounted. I've never seen a circuit board mounted in a rear light before in a mod. I just can't believe it. You can even see the wires that are coming into the circuit board to control the LEDs. Just wow. Rear zone of the car, suspension there, double wishbone push rod at the back. If we hit the space bar, we can take the rear wing off and unload the suspension to get a better sense of what's going on back here. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous level of detail. If we go into free cam, one more detail that I want to show you. You can see these temperature stickers here that are on the rear suspension on the wishbones. The teams use these, they still use these today, just to monitor peak temperatures on the wishbones here. These, believe it or not, are modeled. They are animated. They will actually change the peak temperature reading as you're out on track, and they will display the peak temperature reached by this particular component on this section of the car. I've yet to see this for myself, but RSS say that this is animated, So I have a tendency to believe them. I don't know if they're animated in showroom. We put the car back together, the suspension loads up. They don't appear to be animated here in showroom view, but while we're out on track, once we're done doing that, perhaps I'll find a way to see this in action in a replay and cut it into the video somewhere, because we need to see that happen if indeed it is happening. It's just ridiculous levels of detail. One thing that we must do, go into the cockpit here in showroom view. We'll do this reasonably long fly around here. And then into the cockpit, of course, you still do have the Por favor no tocar sign there, but we can pull that away. And this is more or less our view from the cockpit. We're sitting a little bit low in here, but this is the view that we have. One criticism that people have already made of this mod is the steering wheel height. They say it's a little bit too high. I say it's just fine, but apparently RSS are going to be lowering it by 25 millimeters or so in a soon-to-be-released patch of this car. But as of the moment, this is the car as it was released on Christmas Day 2018, so it's what we have to deal with. We took a look at the steering wheel and general cockpit area a little bit earlier on, so we won't spend too much time, but you can see the steering wheel is completely blank right now as the car switched off. Once we get the car on track, this all comes alive and we'll go through the voluminous amounts of instrumentation that we get. Looking around the cockpit surround, you can see the Alcantara padding that you'd get. Also, the cockpit surround where the cushioning is, the memory foam insert that will keep the driver from getting too much whiplash in the event of a lateral impact. It's there. Looking up, there's our air snorkel for the engine air intake. Carbon fiber modeled inside and out for the chassis. We hit the spacebar again, we can remove the cockpit surround, get a better sense of what the chassis actually looks like. There are the other extraction straps there, just to pull the seat and driver out in one piece if need be. There are the little clips holding the cockpit surround in place. Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable. Honestly, I can find nothing to criticize about this car at all. It is simply a work of art in every possible regard. Just looking at it like this, it does add a sense of adventure, as RSS have already described, but really, the way that we need to see this car is in this configuration, out on track, being driven to within an inch of its life, which is exactly what we shall do next. Stand by. Welcome to Catalunya. Before we get out on track, of course, a look through the setup screen, but before we even do that, just take a look at the car before us right now. You see, it has the tire blankets affixed. Yes, the tire blankets from showroom view, they carry over into the pit lane before you load the car up to go drive. They go away once you get into the car for the first time, but when you first load up to the track, there are the tire blankets, and it is really a fantastic detail. It does add to that sense of immersion. RSS have done things like this in the past. Formula Hybrid 2017, for example, when you first load to the track, the headrest is removed from the car. I thought that was a pretty cool detail. This is even cooler in my estimation. Very nice that they have included something like that here. We had to cover that straight away because the moment we load the car up, they go away and they will never be seen again. So I just wanted to make sure that we saw that. But the setup screen as follows. Gear display, 7-speed semi-automatic gearbox, of course, and you can adjust those ratios to your heart's content, 1st through 7th, plus the final drive. Default gearing is shown here, theoretical Vmax at 322 clicks. Tires. We've got 3 tire compounds to choose from: soft, medium, and hard. Of course, bespoke tires in this era. Bridgestone and Michelin. Ferrari would have been running Bridgestone tires, as they quite famously had that collaboration in this era. It defaults to soft, though. Tire pressure adjustment, 11 psi on the front and 10 psi on the rear are our default values. Range of adjustment goes from 8 to 24 psi. We'll bring that back to default. Fuel, it's zeroed out right now to keep the engine quiet. Maximum fuel capacity is 144 liters, and the default fuel load is right down here at 50. We'll shut that down for the moment. Aerodynamics, the only aero adjustments we can make are the front and rear wings. It defaults to 25 front and rear. Range of adjustment on the front wing goes from 1 to 30, as well as on the rear wing 1 to 30.
Brakes, brake bias and brake power. Brake bias defaults to 53% to the front. Brake power is at 100%, as you might want it in a car like this. Range of adjustment on brake bias goes from 46% to 64%. Of course, all of this relative to the front axle. Drivetrain, differential adjustments in power, coast, and preload, as we're accustomed to seeing, defaults to 15% locking on the power, 30% on the coast, and preload is 30 Newton meters. You can adjust these between 0 and 100 in power and coast. Preload goes from 0 to 200 Newton meters, as you might expect there. First suspension screen, we've got 5 suspension screens. First, just alignment on all 4 corners, camber and toe. Default values are shown. Main suspension screen, these are your anti-roll bars, ride heights, wheel rates, and travel ranges on all 4 corners. Dampers, these are the primary dampers on the wishbones, bound and rebound both fast and slow on all 4 corners. Our third spring here, the heave dampers, these are the dampers that specifically control vertical acceleration up and down, wheel rates, and travel range, and then the bound and rebound speed as well, fast and slow. The fifth and final suspension screen, the bump stops. This basically sets the extreme travel limit of the suspension on all 4 corners, as well as on the third springs or your heave springs, whatever you want to call them. Various, this is the steering assist, the power steering, defaults to 85. Visuals, here's where things get a little bit interesting. Go into free camera view and you can see that the wheel covers, the tire warmers have come off and the driver has now entered the cockpit. But you can see here on the rear wing, we'll move a little bit closer into the rear wing, it has 3 values that we can choose from. It defaults to 1, which is medium downforce. If we go to 0, you can see we get a third flap element in there for high downforce, medium downforce as we saw, and then low downforce as we saw from showroom view. This is basically your Monza spec wing. On the front end of the car, we can go here. On the side of the nose, we have the TV camera as we're accustomed to seeing. You can just see it there on the lower part of your screen on the left-hand side. It's on the right side of the car. We can take it off the car if we want, or we can put it on the left side of the nose cone, screen right from our vantage point. You can see that they have modeled the camera mount there inside where the camera lens would be. Absolutely fantastic. It does default to value 2 here on the right-hand side of the car. In the cockpit, what we see, the steering wheel, it has now come alive, and we'll go through the instrumentation, but we can also change the LCD colors. Yes, first time I've seen something like this as well. Defaults to value 2 here, which is red, but we could also change it to green as well as blue if you want. Personally, I prefer the red or the green. The blue does get a little bit difficult to see in direct sunlight, but we'll leave it at default red for the moment. Speaking of default, we will bring the car 100% back to default setup for our first run. And here it is, and the engine is alive. Now, in the cockpit, now that the instrumentation is all alive in here, we can go through all of the various functions and displays that we are seeing. Across the top of the steering wheel, you can see on the left-hand side, 3,000. That is our crankshaft RPM. There's our tachometer. We're idling at about 3,000 RPM. To the right of that, we have our speedometer in kilometers per hour, obviously displaying 0 right now. Below that, you can see a row of 3 clusters of 2 lights. Those are flashing to indicate that the pit lane speed limiter is currently active. Below that, we have what I'll call our primary LCD, and it's the only other LCD in here. This is where we're getting the majority of our information about the car. Currently, you can see our lap time ticking away there, just ticking past 6:24. Above that, you will see a live delta relative to your previous session best, and then below that, you will see your session best and your current lap time. Below that, you have a lap counter, LPS1 right now. We're on lap 1 and F50 right now. That is our fuel level in liters, 50 liters of fuel on board in this default trim. To the right of that, in the rest of the window, obviously, that is our gear position indicator. Right now, we're in neutral. Remember, 7-speed semi-auto box in this car. We can row up through the gears if we like, up into 7th gear, and then down back into neutral, and then reverse, obviously. Little detail that I do want to point out, and if you've seen my first impressions video of this car, we've already covered this, but as I drop it into neutral, watch what happens. You see the green N button in the upper left of the steering wheel? Just look at that. I drop it into neutral, and we have a little green light that comes on beside that button just to indicate that we're in neutral. Now, look to the bottom right of the steering wheel. You can see the blue R button with the red R in it. Just look slightly to the left of that. I'll drop it into reverse, and then a red light comes on next to that button just to let us know that, hey, we're in reverse. We're going to go backward if we don't do something about that, unless we want to, of course. Back into neutral and off the clutch. This is where the car just generally sits as it's ticking over at idle. But we don't want merely to tick over at idle in this car. No, that's not what this thing is designed to do. What we want to do is drive it, and that we shall do in earnest. Clutch in. First gear. Bring the revs up a bit. Let the clutch out gradually. And off we go on to the racetrack. It's up and down through the box. Getting everything happy and ready to go, and we'll start building tire and brake temperature. I've chosen Catalunya for this review for two reasons. One, it is a place where this car would have been racing in the year 2000. Of course, Mika Häkkinen actually won the 2000 Spanish Grand Prix in the McLaren. Michael Schumacher led the race in the beginning, but he had a bad pit stop and he lost actually on the podium. He lost out on the podium position there, but he did get pole position for the Spanish Grand Prix that year with a lap of 120 and change. I think that time is reachable in this car. The other thing that we have to talk about before we really let it go, the sounds on this car. These are probably, and I say probably, the best sounds of any open-wheeler in any racing sim ever. Not only is it the very melodic and harmonious V10 that we all know and love, but RSS went through the trouble to pour through hundreds of hours of onboard footage from this car and ones immediately preceding and succeeding it, such as the F399 and F2001, very similar engines, of course, and they took the time to map the engine sound of this car harmonically. Every frequency in nature, just the way physics works, has several different overtone frequencies. It's just how harmonics happens to work in this world of ours. Everything has a fundamental, which is the primary tone that you hear, no matter what sound you're hearing, and then it has harmonic overtones, which just follow via the Fibonacci sequence, basically. You have a fundamental frequency, and then you have harmonic hotspots in a spectrograph that will light up in different areas of the sonic range. So typically, if you know about music, you have a fundamental frequency, and then you have an overtone, usually at the interval of a fifth, and then a third, and then a fourth, and a seventh, and then an octave, either above or below, depending on where we are in our register. And that is what's responsible for the very melodic and harmonious sounds of a V10 engine. V10s just naturally produce tones chromatically through a major third. It's a fundamental concept in Western music, and it's why V10 engines sound so good. RSS went through the trouble to map all of that on a spectrograph and then reproduce those waveforms and all their harmonic overtones in the sound files for this car. It may be the most thorough job ever done on sounds in sim racing. But enough with the technical nonsense. Let's drive this car the way it was intended. Onto the start-finish straight, letting it go, bringing the revs all the way up to 18,000 or so. Nudging 300 clicks down the start-finish straight in Formula 2000 V10 on the binders, real hard into turn one. Again, default setup, so we're not totally trimmed out here, but we are pretty close to what this car can do. If you watch my pedal traces there in the lower left, you will start to see my inputs, and you'll start to see just how tentative you do have to be in this car, especially when you're just bringing it up to speed. A lot of people already have reported trouble driving this car, and in my opinion that has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the mod, if we can even talk about the quality of this mod. I think quality is basically too knock-off a term to be using for something like this. It is the most detailed car ever released by one of the best modding teams in sim racing. But the way that this car drives. It is very different from what we're accustomed to. Of course, we do have V10 Formula 1 cars already in Assetto Corsa and other sims, namely from Kunos we have the F2004, from BRC we have the Renault R25 and the McLaren MP420 and the Ferrari F310B and the Williams FW19, so we have a lot of cars that are quite similar to this, both in their overall configuration as well as the era in which they were racing, but this car is going to drive differently from all of them. Why? Because RSS have also gone through the trouble to read technical manuals, which I'm led to believe are from Ferrari, on the specific details of this car in terms of its construction, weight distribution, specific masses for specific components. They've even gone through wind tunnel data in emulating the physics on this car. So, when this thing is coming up to temperature, it is going to be absolutely vile. You can't just murder it straight out of the pits as you can in many other cars. You've got to bring it up gradually. You have to just let it work. Of course, cars of this era were also very twitchy, as this car is. Remember, we're looking at this car through a modern lens, through a 2018 lens. Formula 1 cars today are faster over the course of a single lap than they ever have been. And of course, if we didn't have this starting the race with as much fuel as you're going to use during the race rule, if we had refueling, they would be faster on race pace than any other car as well. But they also have tremendous amounts of downforce, and they have slick tires, and they have engines that are producing more torque than NASCAR Sprint Cup or Nextel Cup or Monster Energy Cup, whatever's sponsoring that deplorable series today. They've got tons of torque, tons of mechanical grip, and tons of aero grip. That's just not what you have in a car of this era. If you watch onboards from 1999 through 2001, you will see these drivers wrestling with these cars pretty much through every corner. Even though the way to drive this car is to be as smooth and as gradual as possible, you've got to be ready to catch it, because it does not want to go in a straight line. It does not want to follow a continuous smooth arc through the corners. It does not want to brake in a straight line. Everything about this car is a compromise in terms of your driving style. To compound that problem is just the way this engine delivers its power. It does not have a lot of torque, and it really doesn't have all that much power below 15,000 RPM. So you'll notice in a lot of the videos that I've done and some other people have done, we're playing with the gear ratios a lot. You'll hear different intervals between the gear changes, watching different people's videos as we figure out how to set this car up. You've got to keep the engine in that power band, which again starts at about 15,000 revs. Below 15,000, it's pretty linear, but then you get an explosion of power as you cross that 15,000 revs threshold, and then you can really get on it. This requires non-linear inputs with the throttle, but it also requires you to be exceptionally smooth on the throttle as well. You often see me stabbing at the gas in a lot of other onboards where I'm showing you telemetry. You can't really do that in this car. You've got to be very smooth and very deliberate. The car is unbelievably sensitive to driver input, which means if you're not being unbelievably sensitive to what the car wants to do, you're going to have a bad day. Remember also, you've got groove tires. Groove tires were introduced for the 1998 season. Initially, they just had 3 grooves cut into them. They went up to 4 grooves for 1999, then that continued all the way up to 2008. But the idea for that was to reduce cornering speeds, reduce some mechanical grip. It did put more emphasis on aerodynamics, of course, as we later saw at the end of this overall philosophy of design in 2008. But it also made the cars much more challenging to drive at medium and low speeds. You can see how I'm changing my steering angle a bit as the car starts to grip and then slip and starts to grip again. Even through medium and high speed corners, this becomes an issue when you'd expect to have a lot of aero grip. And you do have a lot of aero grip. It's just not the same as it is in a modern car. So if you're looking at this car through the lens of 2018, you're going to be absolutely terrible driving it. You've got to bring yourself back to what the performance envelope was in 2000. The cars generally were much easier to operate in this era. They didn't have as many systems and subsystems to worry about. Also, they were not nearly as sensitive to airflow in terms of dirty air and things like that. These cars are momentum managers. You've got to think in 3 axes when you drive a car like this. In my head, I basically picture a Cartesian coordinate plane in an X, Y, and Z axis, and just picturing the car in the center of all of that and trying to extrapolate how it's going to rotate. Pure chassis dynamics of this thing, they feel pretty neutral, but it's the tire that really does limit you in terms of your confidence. Again, the groove tires, they cut your mechanical grip drastically. So when the car starts to rotate, you have to work with the rotation. Don't try to resist it. Don't try to keep correcting it, because you will just overwhelm the tires and you will spin. On the brakes, you can basically brake as late as you can, maybe a little bit sooner than you can in a modern car. None of that has anything to do with the mechanical grip or the aero grip, though. Where this car is gaining that braking advantage is purely due to mass. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Well, this car simply has less mass than a modern one. The formula weight in this aero is 605 kilograms. This car weighs 605 kilograms dry. Formula One today, they weigh 734 kilograms, or is it 744 kilograms now with Halo and other safety measures that have come in between 2000 and 2019. But whatever, this car weighs a good 120 kilograms less than a modern car. So you can be pretty late on the brakes, even though this car is 18 years old. .22.214. That's not too bad. That definitely would have got me on the grid for the 2000 Spanish Grand Prix. Of course, we're not 100% going for it. This is default setup, and I'm talking to you. So I don't have my full powers of concentration at my disposal right now, but that's a reasonable time. Well within 107%. Hard over those apex curves, on the throttle, short shift a little bit into second. No traction control in this car, of course. I know some people have been a little bit confused, even saying some nasty things about it, wondering, oh well, how come RSS have given us another V10 Formula One car? Don't we have enough of them already? We don't have too many V10 Formula One cars that have no driver rates whatsoever. It's a completely different kettle of fish. The closest we have to this is the MP413 on R Factor 2, and I have to say this car drives similarly to that. That car, of course, put together with actual data from the actual McLaren Formula One team. This one, yep, it's in the same family for sure. Lets you know that RSS have done a really good job. On our 10th lap now in this stint. Tires are definitely wearing in. The ultimate grip has gone a bit. But it is pretty linear. You would expect the tires to wear out a bit after 10 laps, and that's where we are. But the car's not doing anything untoward. It's not too snappy. It's not catching me out. Again, you've just got to let the car dictate to you what it wants to do. Yes, of course, ultimately, you are making all the same decisions that you would make driving any other car, but this one requires a little bit more prodding. You've got to be gentle. You must be very polite to it. 1.970. That's respectable. I'm okay with that. That would be good for the top 10, I think. A bit of understeer there through turn 3. Again, modern cars are taking that flat out easily. Not these. You've got to drive them. They're a challenge. Roof tires, no traction control, not a whole lot of aero, relatively speaking. They're a challenge. Here. Yep, there we go. That's what I mean. You've got to be on top of it. I left the downshift a little bit too late. A little bit of rear locking, not even a total stop on the rear axle, but it's enough to unsettle the thing. And there you go, because we have that spin in Sector 3, the rear tires are now a little bit too hot, so you will get oversteer even at high speeds, so that's always an experience. You've just really got to be keyed in. We've cooked the rear tires now. Hits big bumps into the pit lane here, of course. Slow it down. 80 clicks. Let's see. What's a pit stop look like? There we are. Pulling away from the pits. Yep, easy as you like. The car hooks up pretty nicely. However, what we really should do is go back into our pit screen, put a little bit of a different setup on this car. First of all, here's our telemetry trace here. We have our best lap, and then we have our last lap. The best lap is in red, and yeah, you can just get a sense of what's going on. My personal best around this track is a 121.342. And our last lap was a 126, obviously going into the pit lane there at the end. But not too bad. You can just see how you have to have your inputs. You've got to be reasonably linear with everything in this car because, well, it doesn't have traction control, it doesn't have slick tires, and it doesn't have all that much downforce, especially at lower speeds. So you just see, in particular, my throttle trace, what's going on here. Of course, all of the big blips here. This is the auto blip across the downshift, and you can see we are going down through the gearbox in this section here. But picking up the throttle, it's got to be pretty linear. I like to stab at the gas in a lot of cars, not in this one. It's got to be pretty progressive until you come back up to the top. And then, of course, as you get wheel spin and things like that, you've got to modulate accordingly. But yeah, it's pretty linear. Here we've got a little bit of a jagged profile, but generally you can see what's going on. You've got to be progressive with your control inputs. It's very important. That is how you're going to get the most out of this car. But in any regard, let's put a little bit of a custom setup in. Again, nothing too spectacular in terms of what we're doing. I just want to lower the top speed a bit because we are going to get some aero drag there. Take some fuel out. A little bit more wing. Brake bias is fine. Diff is fine. Our suspension settings are all default. So that's fine by me. Let's go out and see what we can do. Definitely feeling the lower fuel load now and the newer tires. Car really feels like it wants to come alive. There we go, into our flying lap. Braking at about 90 meters. Yeah, that's not too far off of where the 2018 guys are braking. First gear, road drops away, feed the power in, now on the gas. On the brake, second gear, a little bit of trail braking, on the power as quickly as you dare. Down to fourth, trail braking, feed the throttle in, full throttle through mid-corner. First gear. For what was the only good Sector 3 configuration ever at this place. A little bit of oversteer on initial turn in, just let the car drift, it'll come back to you. On the power, fourth gear, bit of a breathe, hard on the power, watch the bump, fifth gear, fourth gear again for the final corner, full throttle by mid-corner, over the exit curves, over the line, 121, 322. Is that a new personal best here? I don't know, I think it might be. Bit of understeer through turns 1 and 2. Just deal with it. Turn 3 is never flat. Little bit of mid-corner high speed oversteer. That'll wake you up. On the power as quickly as you dare. Third, fourth. Back down into first for the apex. Just stay just wide of the apex curves. On the throttle. Second, third, fourth, fifth. Down 2 gears, to the left, a little wide, to the right. On the power again, we're gear too high there. That pushed me wider than I wanted to be. It's okay, a little bit of power oversteer again across the exit there of Kamsa. The car is definitely twitchy. I like that a lot. Just what I like in a car. I don't like that they're bolted to the ground these days. I don't like that you see essentially no variation in driver technique. Everybody's just out there like robots. You gotta drive these things. This is what Formula One only ever should have been. They should have taken this rule set and just said, no more, we're done. We're driving these from hereafter. We're going to run out of gas pretty soon. take it back? We're going to find out. One liter of fuel remaining. Got roughly half a lap still to go. Might just coast back into the pit lane on fumes. Here we go. 0 liters indicated. Back into the pits. The engine's still running. Maybe not for much longer, but we have made it back. And of course, last technical thing to note here, there is no lockout on neutral. So you do have to watch the downshifts if you get a little bit too over-enthusiastic. But, yeah, that is it. RSS Formula 2000 V10. It is one of the best cars I have ever driven anywhere in any sim. It is definitely the best car that Race Sim Studio have ever made, and with the caliber of workmanship that these guys regularly show off to us, that is no mean compliment. If anybody out there could ever have outdone themselves, it's these guys, and here it is. It's the most detailed model that they have ever made. It's the most detailed physics that they have ever made. They've used actual data from the actual car. They've gone to museums to visit the actual car and to take pictures and take measurements and things like that. They have analyzed the engine note scientifically and recreated its entire harmonic series throughout the entire rev range. They've modeled 50 individual LEDs in the cockpit. They've given us 3 different versions of the rear wing. They've made the front wing and rear wings flex. They've added vibrations on the cockpit surround. They've even put up a velvet rope and tire blankets and jacks and ramps in the show roof view, and it's absolutely ridiculous, and I can't think of any other compliments to give to this car other than go out right now and buy this thing over at racesimstudio.com. Links in the description, of course. It's absolutely phenomenal. There is nothing better out there in sim racing today than Formula 2000 V10 by Race Sim Studio. It is simply the greatest car ever seen in Assetto Corsa, and I dare say it is the greatest single-seater that we have ever seen in sim racing. And that is not something that I dish out lightly. There are great modding teams out there working in Assetto Corsa today. Of course, we have Race Sim Studio, but we also have VRC, and they have made tremendously great cars, both in terms of sounds and physics and visuals and everything. But this is simply another step forward in the natural progression of things. Sim racing, it's basically the Wild West. It happens on the internet, which of course is the Wild West. And whenever you've got a Wild West sort of situation, a natural ebb and flow of progress occurs. This is simply the next step in where sim racing modding is going to be. The way that they have shoehorned all of these features into Assetto Corsa, which is already 4 years old. It's no longer the latest and greatest. It's eclipsed by Assetto Corsa Competizione. It's eclipsed graphically by Project Cars 2. It's certainly eclipsed in terms of chassis dynamics by R-Factor 2 and iRacing. But RSS have chosen to stay with Assetto Corsa and use it as a platform upon which to build something truly special and something that I think is going to be remembered for years to come as one of the greatest technical triumphs in modding history as far as the sim racing community is concerned. I cannot dish out enough accolades for these guys. The best compliment I can give it is to say that you're asking too little money for it, and if everybody who watches this video could go buy this car and just do a couple laps in it, you'll understand why I can't stop gushing about it. It is absolutely perfect in every way. And I don't think I have ever said that about any mod, any track, any car, any racing sim ever. It is perfect. Perfection, meet Race Sim Studio. Race Sim Studio, perfection. How do you do? Please do stay tuned. We do have onboard and external replay hot laps here at Catalunya in this car. We also have some closer views of some of the interactive visual features at work. We've got a look at the rear suspension and that sticker, which I'm not sure you can see doing its animation thing in that clip, but you can see the lower wishbone of the rear suspension bouncing around, as well as the half shaft coming out of the gearbox. We can also see the front wing flex from another camera angle that I do have coming up. But truly, this is the greatest car ever. Go get it right now. Stay tuned for the hot laps, everyone. Ferrari Man 601, thanking you very much for joining me today. I do hope that you've enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, the comments section is yours. Stay tuned for the hot laps. Until next time, thank you all very much, and of course, we will see you soon.